I'm going to talk about something that's kind of the past, present, and future of interactive computing technology. So here's a quick outline. I'm going to take you through a very quick history of interactive computing, mainly because I want to frame it in a particular way so that I can make sense of where we are with what I'll call the third generation of computing, ubiquitous computing, which I think is, from a researcher's perspective, has kind of come to its natural ending. And I want to talk about a fourth generation of computing that has already emerged, and I'll talk to you about that, something that I call collective computing, but that name isn't as important as the framing of it. Then I'll talk about two interesting research challenges that fall within this fourth generation, one of which is kind of application agnostic. It has to do with how we provide unifying user experiences in the world of what I will call shroud technologies that you'll understand in a little bit. And then an application of taking this notion of quantified self and amplifying it to a collection of individuals, something they'll call quantified communities. And then if we have some time at the end, I want to speculate about another big project that I've launched at Georgia Tech and with other colleagues on what I think is the next set of technologies that we could call the fifth generation of computing. So for probably 2/3 of the talk, most of it is encapsulated in an article that came out in January in IEEE Computer. So fill yourself up. If you're feeling a little bit tired, you can tune out for maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then I'll wake you up when it's something that you won't be able to read about in this particular article. So first, a brief history of computing, where I will go through 67 years of computing history in about 67 seconds, plus or minus a few seconds. But the point here is that new computing technologies, when they come to be and someone has a vision of how they might be used, it changes our perception of the relationship between humans and that technology. And the first example I'll talk about, or the first generation of computing, is the actual beginning of what we'll refer to as automated computing. And the visions of that came about in around the mid-30s when people started, like Turing, started talking about what it would mean to create an automated general-purpose computing machine. What's interesting about this is to think about what was the relationship between devices and the technology, what was the canonical technology of that generation, and what were what I'm calling the initial applications that drive adoption of the technology, and then once the technology has been adopted, what are follow-on applications that come from that. So to quickly go through for this first generation, the idea with the canonical technology was the mainframe. And the relationship between people and that device was that there would be many people interacting with a single mainframe device. And since these came about during the wartime, the World War II, what really drove the adoption of mainframe computing was scientific calculation to be able to calculate ballistics so that you could determine where to fire particular bombs and missiles, and being able to encrypt or decrypt coded messages. So one of the reasons I don't refer to these initial applications as killer applications is because quite literally they were killing applications that drove the adoption of mainframe. But after the war, when people had seen the power and opportunity of these mainframe devices, you then saw organizations adopt it for other purposes like data processing, to be able to handle human resources, accounts receivable, and things like that. We move on about 30 years from then, and we have some visionaries like Alan Kay in the mid to late 60s talk about this emergence of new technologies that would allow you to essentially shrink the form factor of all the computing capabilities down to the point where it could sit near or on someone's desktop. And what was interesting about this was that they were pushing this notion of each individual having their own computing device, a dedicated device, so a one-to-one relationship of people to devices. And the canonical technology has become known as the personal computer. Now, what drove the adoption of personal computing was very similar. It was organizations that essentially adopted personal computing because they wanted to take particular forms of office practices and represent them in an electronic form. And the electronic spreadsheet was the first successful example of that. But what happens shortly after you had a variety of these in an organizational setting, they used them for other electronic analogs, so an electronic typewriter or a word processor, an electronic database management system. So those were some of the follow-on applications that resulted there. And finally, we move forward about 20 years later, and we see a whole other set of visionaries, Mark Weiser being the most well-known of these, who talked about another generation of computing technologies. And if you haven't read it, you should take time to read this article that came out in Scientific American in September 1991, The Computer for the 21st Century, as one of the most beautiful first lines of a technical article I've ever read. The most profound technologies are those that disappear. And we're going to come back to this a couple of times in the talk. But the interesting thing that Weiser talked about was that now there wasn't going to be a single canonical technology. There were going to be a variety of them, because his point was that computing could take many different shapes and sizes. And so you could have things that would fall at the inch scale, and so these would be small devices that you could carry around with you. They might even be disposable, they're so small and easy to produce and provide very interesting but not no longevity to them. You might have larger things, foot scale devices, and these were not the smaller desktops or laptops of the time, but these were other special purpose tablet-like devices. Or you could have what he called yard scale devices, things like an electronic whiteboard or large billboards that were used by organizations that were more kind of stationary and used by many people at once. Now, what kind of drove the adoption of these technologies? I'm going to show you examples in the handheld or small device. What drove the adoption of these in the mid-90s were two driving applications. One was the ability to synchronize your calendar and contact database with a desktop, a stationary database of these things, and you could carry it around conveniently with you. Those that might remember things like the Palm Pilot or the not-so-successful Newton Message Pad were devices of that ilk. But at the same time, people used human-to-human communication, either by voice or by text through mobile phones, were also encouraged lots of adoption of this. We know, and I'll come to this later, these technologies merged into what we call the smartphone today. But there are also some follow-on applications that came from these. Once people had invested in devices that they had with them all the time, and companies had invested in the infrastructure to allow those devices to be connected, either to themselves or to other databases, location services, examples of social media, the whole app ecosystem, those all kind of emerged from that. So that takes us through those 67 years of the evolution of interactive technology. And a few years ago, I started to feel a little discouraged or lacking motivation that there was any new ideas coming out of this area called ubiquitous computing. And I wrote an article that did a slight twist on Weiser's words and said, well, actually what's happened with ubiquitous computing or pervasive computing, whatever you want to call it, was that it had become so prevalent in all of computing research that it essentially disappeared as its own niche topic. So it had become a profound research topic that had disappeared. Unfortunately, what I didn't do in that article was talk about, well, what's next? And really what I was trying to say is there's a rallying call to say, what are the next visions? And why did I think that there should be some more driving visions? So I now want to switch a little bit and talk about the last decade or so of interactive technologies and what technologies have emerged and how they've shown different kinds of promises. So we'll fill this out by taking a look at this chart and say, well, what are the answers? How do we essentially fill in these particular cells for the fourth generation? And some of these things are relatively easy and straightforward to put forth. So I think it's very conservative to say that about 20 years or so from the previous vision of the third generation, we should have expected the emergence of some new technologies that were not foreseen by Weiser and his colleagues. We all know that the pace of technological advancement has not been slowing down, it's been speeding up. So since in the last few years, we were more than 30 years away from the original visions, I said there had to have been some advances. So I forced myself to think in terms of what had happened by the mid-2000s. So that's why that column gets filled out rather straightforwardly. There's only one way, if you interpret this the way it was suggested, there's only one thing that could be left there. So now we're talking about an era where many people interacting with many devices, and maybe those things are facilitating the many people communicating with each other, or the devices communicating with each other as mediated by people. There's another nuance to this I could get into if people want, because I think there's more ways to understand this that'll extend to the fifth and sixth generations of technology, but I won't bore you with that. What I will do is try not to bore you about what goes in these two columns. So I always thought it was rather clever how Weiser used this notion of the inch, the foot, and the yard. It's somewhat memorable, but I guarantee you I'm going to give you a more memorable way to think about the canonical technologies of the fourth generation. So the first one, What are the kind of technologies that have emerged that Weiser didn't really foresee? Well, one thing, surprisingly enough, in 1991 that Weiser didn't foresee was the World Wide Web. Just an example of distributed computing. Now, the notion of distributed computing, at least in computer science circles, has been known since at least 1978. The idea that you could programmatically have computers interact with other computers. We had networks and distributed computational capabilities by doing email long before that, but thinking about systematically having devices interact with each other goes back to a seminal article by Phil Enslow in 1978. That's where we have the roots of distributed computing. We have the World Wide Web as one example of how we can deliver information to people in a way through a very distributed mechanism. But we also have a variety of other kinds of capabilities that essentially have put us today in a state where computational cycles and storage is a commodity that doesn't have to be in something that we hold in our hands or that we have in a closet nearby in our particular computing facility. Those are things that as long as we have a network connection to, we can essentially have for the right price at an unlimited quantity. And that really fundamentally changes how we think about being able to get access to the computing and storage needs that we have on any given day. So there's the cloud. And these emerged, funny enough, around 2004, 2005. 2008 was when Amazon released its commercial Elastic Cloud services. It was the middle of the last decade that cloud technologies really took hold. Next one, the crowd. And you may be sensing a trend here. We have a variety of ways of reintroducing humans into the computational platform. So those of you, many of you probably know that prior to 1930, when we referred to a computer, we were referring to typically a woman sitting at a desk in a room with lots of other people tabulating numbers. They were the computers. Turing's computer was referred to as an automated computer. And then over time, we dropped the automated. Now, turns out, last decade, by a number of people in the HCI community and other communities, started showing ways you could systematically and programmatically reintroduce humans into the digital or information ecosystem. They could be people that provided information, so crowdsourcing information like authoring content, such as you get in Wikipedia, or they could be answering or providing answers to very simple questions through things like reCAPTCHA or through Amazon Mechanical Turk. So we now have this very interesting phenomenon today where we've blurred the distinction between what is doing the computing. Is it an algorithm on a piece of silicon, or is it a collection of humans, or is it a combination of the two? And in fact, we don't even care most of the time. The question goes out, the answer comes back, and we don't care or don't necessarily have to know what actually did the actual computation. Okay, so we've got the cloud and we've got the crowd. So what's the other piece of technology? Well, here I'm going to build to this a little bit because I'm trying to build anticipation in the audience here. So we have the Internet of Things, which really is an Internet of connected devices. Here's an example in a home setting, a variety of devices that can be connected, and we can provide some kind of seamless control, the humans interacting with these devices or the devices interacting with each other. We also have another trend that has emerged, and that is the proliferation of devices that we can wear on our body. So a phone we don't wear on our body in the same way. We usually have it nearby in a pocket or in a bag near us, but we also have a variety of devices today, health fitness trackers, smart watches, even heads-up displays or displays that are pointing out and recording things. So a variety of wearable devices. So we have the Internet of Things or devices, and we have wearable things together. What's the combination of that? So we've got the cloud, we've got the crowd, and we have the shroud of these technologies. Now, you might think shroud, what a morbid image you've given to us, Abowd. Yes, but a shroud is essentially a covering over a physical object. It's now connecting the physical world to the electronic world. That's the notion of shroud that I want you to think about. But I also want you to think about shroud because that's memorable, right? We've got the cloud, the crowd, and the shroud. Inch, foot, yard, nice try, Mark. Cloud, crowd, shroud. You're going to remember that one. And if you don't remember, just remember that's what Abowd said. And the funny thing about it is that I gave this talk for 9 months before it was pointed out to me that it rhymes with my last name. So that was unintentional, but a fortunate thing. Okay, So now you know what the canonical technologies are. We got to fill in this last cell, which is what is it that are the initial driving applications for this fourth generation technologies, and what might be some follow-on. So this first one I'll point out to you has already emerged, but it also is an example of a class of applications that I think are a really good challenge for us to attack. So let me build the example here. If you know me at all, and the people probably coordinating this trip know enough about me to attest to this, I don't pay a lot of attention to planning the logistics when I travel. Why? Because I don't have to, right? All I need to know is when I land at the airport, where do I need to get to, right? I can find the rental car or find the taxi. I just need to know where's that endpoint. Well, why is that the case? It's because I carry a device with me that is going to allow me to navigate to where I need to go. Now, I grew up in Farmington Hills, Michigan, so not far from Ann Arbor, but I grew up in a family that was devoted to the University of Notre Dame, so I would never come close to Ann Arbor. So I don't really know my way around Ann Arbor. But I can get map information delivered to my device to tell me where the Bell Tower hotel where I was staying and navigate me from Detroit Metro to the Bell Tower Hotel, and I really don't have to worry too much about how to get there. How is that information delivered to me? Well, it's delivered through algorithms that are computed somewhere else and delivered through some cloud technology. So as long as my smartphone is connected to a network, I'm going to be fine. Right? And the reason I say that as long as is how many here travel internationally? And how many here are cheapskates like me and do not have the data plan when you're traveling, right? So how crippled do you feel now when you travel to a foreign country without a data plan and trying to, you have to plan. You've got to figure out how you're going to get from point A to point B before you get on the plane. I mean, you know, before you get your luggage on the other side. So, and that's a real annoyance. Right? We have come to assume this kind of capability, but there's more that we have today in the area of personal navigation. So this is a particularly interesting example from what, so who was with, are there any people who went with me to dinner last night? Yeah, so we had a wonderful experience while we were navigating to dinner because there's some construction on 14 and other places, and so we were socially figuring out how to navigate the right way, and I thought it was hilarious to listen to. We had someone who hadn't been in Ann Arbor very long, someone who'd been in Michigan but 30 years ago and didn't know anything about it, and two other people that knew how to get around Ann Arbor negotiating how to turn this way and do a U-turn to get there to avoid all this particular traffic. I also found it somewhat amusing what you consider to be traffic in Ann Arbor, but that's another quaint discussion that we can have. But an option that's available to people is to not just use the algorithmic from the cloud information. We can use other services like Waze to give you advice about what's going on the roads ahead. And where does the information from Waze come from? It comes from of people. Very good, right? So this crowd is giving you information to help you navigate in ways that the algorithms by themselves might not be able to do very effectively in certain times. But in addition to that, I might want to figure out, well, where do I want to go? There's certain kinds of food I like. I've heard there's a delicatessen in Ann Arbor that's pretty good, but I can't remember the name of it, right? And I think I want to find out what's a good delicatessen, right? So it's Frank's Deli, that's the one, or Fringerman's or something like that. So what do? I pull out Yelp and I tell it what kind of things I like, and sure enough, it pulls up examples. It doesn't always work. I was with my family this weekend from Atlanta going to Birmingham to go to a Pentatonics concert. They were really good. And we wanted to eat at a quaint burger place on the way, and Yelp misguided us, let's just say. Heaven's Burger was not so heavenly. But I can get suggestions about what to do. So it's not just personal navigation, it's personal entertainment. And even more than that, I can find out about who I'd like to be with or who I would not like to be with. So I can get lots of information delivered to me to this device to help me figure out where to go and what I want to go and how to get there. Right? And these are capabilities that we now almost all take for granted but have emerged over the last 10 years. But it gets even more interesting than that because I can get that information delivered to my smartphone. I could get it delivered to my watch. Some of you might even have it delivered to a heads-up display. So these are examples of different kind of shroud technologies that will deliver this kind of information to you. And I would argue that personal navigation and to some extent other location-aware services have driven the adoption of these kinds of technologies. So that leads me to what the theme, application theme is for this fourth generation. And I'll refer to it as collective computing. But what's much more important is this phrase here. You're going to use the cloud to merge data from the shroud of devices with intelligence from the crowd to empower an individual to be able to do things with specialized expertise that they do not have the training to be able to do. They have no right to expect to be able to do certain things, but the cloud, crowd, and shroud together will empower you to do that in almost real time. Another way to think about this is that the individual can in real time or on demand harvest on demand expertise. Or another way to think about it is you can be your own, I showed you an example of being your own tour guide. But we might think about this in other examples as well. How might I be my own health advisor? How might I be my own teacher? So that fills out the fourth generation table here, where I would argue that the initial driving application had been examples of personal entertainment and navigation. But what is an exciting thing for us to be thinking about is how to use the combination of cloud, crowd, and shroud to allow us to provide other examples of harnessing on-demand expertise, or be your own fill in the blank. Okay, you now need to wake up, because that's it for what I've written about before. And all this rest of this stuff is new speculation that you can either pay attention to or disagree vehemently with or enter into discussion. So I want to talk about two research opportunities that fall under this category of fourth generation technologies. One of them has to do with unifying your interaction experience with a disaggregated collection of devices, wearable devices, or you could think shroud technologies. And the other one is a more bold application domain that I'm going to refer to as quantified communities. So, wearable devices. You could have potentially lots of these wearable devices. I would even argue 2 or 3 might be lots of these devices. How many devices do you want to have on your body? And would you ever want to reduce the number of devices on your body if you wanted all the services from those? Now, this is something that we have visited in the past. So I'm going to talk about a historical trend that goes back at least to the second generation. So in the second generation, the world of the personal computer, we had the electronic spreadsheet. So you would have devices that would provide you the ability to have an electronic spreadsheet. Or you could have a device that would allow you to be an electronic typewriter or an electronic database management system. And what happened? We didn't want to have a separate device for my spreadsheet, for my typewriter or word processor or database. We merged them into a single device, the personal computer. So we had an example of single-purpose technologies that merged into a single, more general-purpose one that would do all of these things and more. And the reason was because it was an argument of convenience. At the core of it, all of those capabilities on the left-hand side used the same functional capabilities of the device that we needed, a display and a way to do input. And then there was some differing logic of how we would actually perform the particular application. But those could all be done on a single machine as long as we had an effective way to switch between those different capabilities. And we figured out ways to do that. And then people much preferred just having a single desktop or laptop device that would provide you all of those capabilities and more. This was essentially what happened when you went from initial driving applications to the follow-on applications. But this happened again, multiple times. But I'll just give you one more example. In the third generation, we had the mobile phone, which initially allowed you to talk and text to other people no matter where they were. And we also had personal digital assistants that would let you handle your calendar and contacts and maybe some other things and would sync with an electronic repository that was sitting off the device. What happened? We merged those into a single device called the smartphone. Why? Because they basically needed the same kind of capabilities to provide the mobile phone capability and the personal digital assistant, and people didn't have pockets big enough to hold multiple ones of these devices. So it was convenient to have a single device. It may not have done these things individually as well as them by the devoted devices, but the convenience of having only one trumped out. Okay, so let's think about this notion of when we go from a collection of single-purpose devices to a single general-purpose device and reflect on the shroud technologies. And my argument is in this fourth generation, we'll have things in the wearable world like a health tracker, we might have a smartwatch, we might have glassware. But I will argue that it's a real question as to whether we would ever want or be able to merge all of those into a single device. Because as these things have shrunk down, our ability to interact with them has become more complicated. We could use voice, but voice isn't always appropriate. We can use touch, but the screens are not always as big as we want. Also, some of them do a better job based on where they're located on your body, and we don't always want to have the same capabilities or different capabilities on one place. So the wrist might not be the best place for everything that we would want to track. So I would say what's really happened now is that we are not going to have this merge to a general purpose device in the world of shroud technologies. And I just gave the argument with respect to wearable technologies. Think about all the technologies you'd have in your home as well. And do you want to have all of those controls as well as all the controls and aggregation of wearable things in a single device? You could think about doing that. Maybe it would be convenient, but I would argue that it's not going to be convenient and it's not going to be possible. And what this means is that as a research community, we now have a necessary interaction challenge that we have to address. And that's, we want unified interaction experiences. So when you have a smartphone, you unify things because there's one place to go and I got to learn how to navigate between those capabilities. But it's unified physically. And that's sometimes more favorable. We now need to think about how to have unified interaction experiences when I have a health tracker, a smartwatch, a device head-mounted, and maybe some other devices around in the environment that cannot be physically connected. Because we're not going to be able to create the single-purpose device. And as I said, I gave you the example with wearables. I think there's an even more compelling argument when you think about the Internet of devices and things in the home. So that's one research challenge. And I have a number of students who have explored this particular domain, but I'm not going to bore you with the details of that unless you'd like me to talk about that later. Instead, I'm going to move on to a different kind of application challenge that I think is waiting for us to conquer in the fourth generation. And I call it here quantified campus. And the idea in this particular project is to say, how can the digital footprint of a campus community, and I'll explain what I mean by that digital footprint, how can it reflect or be a predictor of the academic, physical, and mental wellness of the individuals, the stakeholders in that particular campus community? This is an interesting opportunity, and I'm certainly not the first and by no means the only person to think about this opportunity. But why is it important to think about? So those of you who may have gone to my talk yesterday, I talked a lot about the importance of having applications drive what you do as a computer science researcher and the balance you have to play between doing things that are relevant from the applications perspective, but maybe also interesting from a computer science perspective. This is a really good example of this balance between a computing challenge and a challenge to people outside of the computing world. So mental wellness, academic wellness at universities is a serious concern because if you think about undergraduate populations, for most undergraduates, when they come to a university, it's the first time they've had to live on their own. So they have social and independence challenges that they may be tackling for the first time. They're probably in an intellectual environment that is more challenging than they've been used to, so they have an academic stress. And they want to make friends, and they may not have that many people that they knew from their high school that are coming with them. So there are a lot of these things that you have to sort out on your own, and it's not that easy to figure out how to manage these things. As we get older and we look back at those halcyon days of undergrad and think of how wonderful life was, we probably forget the things that we had to learn and that were stressors in our life. But anyone who's connected to campus counseling or mental wellness on universities knows that a large percentage of students have a difficult time coping with the challenges of everyday university life. So there's a motivation for wanting to do something in service of wellness in a campus university. So the question we're looking at is how does the campus community understand for individuals or cohorts of students what the elements are that contribute to stress so that they might understand when is it a particular stressful moment for individuals, when should we deliver interventions to students. And most universities have a pretty intensive orientation period when students first come to campus, and they probably flood them with lots of information. But you're flooding them with information at a time when they may not necessarily understand why that thing about getting exercise, about the importance of having some social connection or having fun, or how you need to regiment your time to spend on studying. Why that's important, because, hey, I'm at college, yeah, let's go drink. Right? So they're trying to figure out how to do this, and you don't deliver the information necessarily at the right time. So the inspiration for this work came from one of my colleagues, Andrew Campbell at Dartmouth College. And he had this project a few years ago that's been published at the Ubicomp conference a couple of times called Student Life, where he took a small cohort of undergrads and graduates that were in courses that he was teaching, and he gave them instrumented Android phones that were collecting passive sensor data. The phone itself is an interesting sensor platform, and it also has information about, things like when you are communicating with it, either through phone calls or through text messaging, what applications you're using. So it is an interesting profile of your activity. It also moves around, and we can know where it's located. So he was interested in looking at that trace of information, but also self-reported information that students might provide in terms of what's your mood at particular times, what activity are you engaged in, did you have trouble today, and how did you think about that trouble? Did you reflect it badly on yourself, or did you try to change the way you thought about it to reduce your stress related to it? So there were that kind of data, and ultimately he showed some very interesting correlations between things that were passively collected on the phone and the self-reports of mood and activity that you could get from people actively giving you that information. And it had a number of us thinking that if we considered this as a fourth-generation application challenge, there's a lot more we can, and I would argue we should do, in this particular application domain. So why is it relevant? Well, I think there's lots of new opportunities to understand this link between human activity and the outcomes that are parameters of wellness. And again, this is at a university context. It's your academic, your physical, and your mental wellness, all things that are of interest. So from a shroud perspective, there's lots of technologies that you can have on or near the body, but there's also interaction with the environment around you that can tell you something about what people in that environment are doing. You have obviously cloud capabilities here, collecting information and doing the right kind of mining and analytics, not just to understand things for an individual, but to compare individuals to other collections of individuals. So interesting predefined cohorts like male versus female, engineering versus liberal arts students, athletes versus non-athletes. Or emerging cohorts, like people who seem to be reporting that their mood is at an all-time low this week. How do they compare to people who say that they're not like this? Or people who last week were reporting this kind of information, things that you wouldn't know in advance that you'd like to be able to compare to. And then finally, the crowd. Interesting ways you can both use the crowd as a means of helping to data mine and understand people's moods. So there are lots of natural language processing and social computing folks that look at social media data as an indicator of people's wellness or some internal state of individuals. But you can also think about the crowd as providing a way to get access to services that people otherwise don't have access to. So those of you that know, on most campuses, the majority of students who need mental wellness counseling do not pursue it. But if they did, the campuses couldn't handle that capacity. So there is a need to be able to not only deliver to individuals information to help them self-reflect. I just thought to have the lights come down. No, I just asked for them to come back up. You're welcome. I didn't have the appropriate single-purpose device to control all these things. But not only do we want to let people to be able to reflect and understand when and how they get into situations that they may want to repeat or they may want to mitigate, but how might you deliver information to people in near real time that come from either computational understanding of what they've done and what others have done in the past to correct a situation, or just to make an easy funnel from a set of experts to be able to channel advice to individuals. So ultimately, you'd like to allow people to be their own academic counselor in this particular example. So this, some of the goals of the project now are to create the right kind of software infrastructure to make it possible and ultimately easy to collect all this information with the right privacy and security guidelines attached to it as well. To empower the students to be their own counselor in the same way that the cloud, crowd, shroud technologies empower us to be our own personal entertainment and navigation assistant. And then to think about this example of the concrete quantified campus in a more general sense in terms of what does it mean to be a quantified community. There are a number of people that are collaborating with us on this particular project. In addition to Andrew Campbell, we have Anin Day and folks at Carnegie Mellon, Tanzim Chowdhury and folks at Cornell, as well as other universities that have expressed an interest in this quantified campus or campus life consortium. So UT Austin, Emory, Northwestern, Cambridge. I'm talking possibly about Michigan being wanted to participate in this particular activity. So that I think is a really nice kind of fourth generation driving application. So I'll stop there with fourth generation and get on to predicting what's going to come next. So with clarity of mind and voice and eye, I'm going to give you a vision of the future, the 2020 vision. Now, again, people who were at my talk yesterday, I confessed that I have this problem with naming things that don't have robust names with respect to time. So my very futuristic project called Classroom 2000 is now no longer seen as that futuristic because of its name. And I know it's clever to say a 2020 vision, but 2020 is not that far out. But that's intentional because I like to dream, but I don't like to dream too far out into the future because I don't feel like I can actually make that happen. But here's something that I think is going to be a real possibility within the next 4 to 5 years. So Weiser's article began with that first sentence. The most profound technologies are those that disappear. But the very next sentence I find extremely interesting. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. Now, Weiser meant this figuratively. But what if we took that line literally? So today, here's what we can do. We can print electronic or computational capabilities on just about any flexible and flat surface. Lots of interesting emerges in the use of inkjet printing to basically produce circuit paths and even some computational elements onto the surface of existing devices. There are also very small sensors that we can produce using nanomaterials that can essentially be woven into existing fabric. So here's an example of a temperature sensor that's woven into some textile that's already produced. So these are examples of computing elements being attached to objects that have already been manufactured. If you saw the New York Times a couple weeks ago, you would have seen, maybe you didn't see that particular picture of Yoel Fink, but you saw him holding these nanowires, which are essentially computational textiles or fibers that can now be produced. And those fibers ultimately will have the ability to do a variety of computational capabilities. So the objects, when they are manufactured, will be computers. There are other roll-to-roll production techniques to be able to produce paper-like objects that will have computing capabilities to them. So what's going to happen tomorrow, and by tomorrow, there are already examples of this being done in labs today. So the idea of tomorrow for me is in 4 to 5 years, it's going to be possible to be able to manufacture at least at a reasonable scale, maybe not large scale, and that's the ultimate goal, but a reasonable scale, the fabrication process for conventional materials, plasterboard, wallpaper, carpeting, surfaces on tables, laminates on tables or on chairs. Those are going to be modified to have computational capabilities at the point of manufacture. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to refer to this as computational skin, by which I mean every physical object will have the opportunity to be covered by something that is computational. And by something being computational, I mean it can store information, it can compute logical operations, it can communicate within the surface and between surfaces, it can sense information from the surrounding environment, it can actuate itself, so provide output, whether that's a display that you can see or some haptic output that you might be able to sense otherwise. And most interestingly, it will be able to harvest the power necessary to do the preceding 4 computational characteristics. So that's what I think computational skin is. Why would you possibly be interested in this computational skin? Well, we might be able to take conventional paper and turn it into something that is a computer. So writing on this piece of paper can actually have the piece of paper know the contents of that piece of paper. So that when I place it on a surface, that information can be communicated to the surface upon which it is placed. You'd also know who put that piece of information there. I could do that with a computational device, and I now have two independent pieces of information that still will compute. And they capture or they harvest the power needed to do that. That's what I'm thinking one might be able to do with paper. Maybe this is a way to address the divide between paper voting and electronic voting, because the paper vote, which has this natural audit trail that people tend to like, even though you can still burn it, but also have some of the properties that an electronic vote might be able to have. We could have food containers be able to understand and sense information about its contents, its temperature, its location throughout time, and to be able to communicate that to other surfaces when they're placed inside it, like on the shelf of a refrigerator, or in the shelf in a store, or on a cabinet or countertop in your home. We might be able to have Kleenex, facial tissue, that when you blow your nose, it can do a chemical analysis, and when you discard it into the wastebasket, it can communicate that information to the appropriate location, scary or otherwise, right? So here are things that you might be able to do. But what's really new in this? Well, I think there are a number of technical breakthroughs. And the first thing, I think, arguably is not a technical breakthrough, it's a mindset breakthrough. The computing industry has been driven since the 60s by this phenomenon called Moore's Law, right, which effectively has said over a short period of time, 12 to 18 months, we're going to be able to either halve the cost of producing the same computational capability or double the amount of computational capability we can put in the same space. And this has totally driven what we mean by success in the computing industry, right? And almost to the point that now when we are probably reaching the physical limits of that kind of exponential growth, people are concerned that it's the doom of the computing industry. And I would argue, no, because there are other ways we might understand the power and possibility of computing other than just how many transistors we can pack into a particular two-dimensional space. When we think about large surface areas, like when I think about the walls in this room, I'm not so much worried about how much I can pack into a small part of that wall, but how can I enable the entire wall to operate appropriately for the kinds of capabilities that I want. I think this is going to lead to an alternative and complementary computing industry. And the question is whether the AMDs or the Intels of the world are going to lead that, or whether the Procter & Gamble, the Georgia Southern, the manufacturing companies of the world might lead this new computing revolution, or an entirely new startup will become the next Facebook or Google because they produce the computational post-it note of the future. The technical breakthroughs are essentially non-silicon-based ways of being able to produce the substrate on which you provide computational capabilities, and this inextricable, and I would argue as a result, natural connection between the physical world and the digital world, because the physical world will be part of the digital world. Now, some of you that have read Weiser's writings about Ubicomp, he mentioned that what he thought was the promise of Ubicomp was bridging the gap between the physical and digital world. But that was typically done by tagging technologies. Now I'm talking about the physical and digital world essentially becoming one, at least at the interface, at the surface. The real interesting challenge here is, how do we do the power harvesting? Well, we can actually print harvesting technologies today, like thermal or solar harvesting technology. So if we can print them, I would argue we can think about how we might produce the right kind of nanomaterials that would have harvesting capabilities. And again, think about the fact that we have large surface areas over which we can do harvesting. And a lot of the problem with harvesting of energy today is because we try to do it in a small area. If we have a larger area, we may have better hope of being able to harvest the energy needed, at least to do simple computation. Finally, we need to rethink. In the same way that we need to rethink whether we drive the progress of computing by Moore's Law, we need to rethink what should drive the parameters of wireless communication. Most people think that what you really want with wireless communication is a high bandwidth over a long distance. And there are applications for that. But I would argue for you, in a world in which we have computational skin, this object, almost every object you can point out is touching some other object. So the wireless communication we need does not have to be very long distance. In fact, I'm not even sure it has to be done by traditional RF wireless. It might be done by other vibrational techniques, because as I place something on something else, I'm introducing some energy or vibration that could be used to modulate other information. So what really excites me about this is it allows us to think outside the box in terms of how we achieve computational capabilities. But ultimately, what's going to drive this is a need for why we would want that. And I'm not going to argue to you that I really have the initial driving application for this 5th generation. But clearly, this is from a presidential report saying that what's going to drive the nanotechnology industry are the right kinds of applications that have the right business model and economic incentive to make happen. So to the extent that we as human-centered computing professionals think about the use of technologies, we do have an obligation or an opportunity to think about what the driving applications might be. So who do you think could possibly do this? Well, we have a very interesting collection of folks at Georgia Tech that come from chemical and biomolecular engineering, so looking at large-scale manufacturing using nanomaterials, materials scientist folks, electrical and computer engineering folks that drive a lot of the printed electronics, systems folks, applications folks, but also people in other universities as well that we've connected with at MIT, at University of Washington, Northwestern, and University of North Carolina, Greensboro. People that mostly come from the world that says, yes, the computer of tomorrow might be a piece of paper, but why would we do that? And how do we assemble and how do we program that kind of computer of tomorrow? So that rounds out what I think is the 5th generation. I'll just make a quick comment that I think this vision is going to emerge over the next few years, which is kind of in the right time scale between the 4th and 5th generation. I said before that we'd filled this out when we went down to the 4th generation, the people-to-device ratio. But there's an interesting subtlety here that if you wanted me to diverge into or digress into my former past as a mathematical modeler, if we look at these as functions and we look at the domains of those functions and the ranges of those functions, they're not complete. So not every human touches every device, and not every device is touched by a human. But I think in a world of computational skin, you will have more examples of all people interacting with all objects, or all objects interacting with a variety of people. So it's even more to the extreme than many-to-many. Computational skin is one canonical technology, and we have to figure out what the driving applications are. So I'll wrap up here just by saying that if we think beyond Weiser's Ubicomp, there are at least 2 generations of technology that are interesting. One that I argued we are embedded in today, this 4th generation of collective computing, and I hope I've shown you some research opportunities in that space. And then we need to get moving on that 4th generation, because around the corner is another set of technologies that are going to drive our imaginations to go even further, and that's this world of computational skin.